go.
Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep, perfect, awesome. Welcome to all of you to the final Heritage Hour of 2023. I'm Turner Douglas, Program Coordinator with the Department of Heritage Services. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us here today. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The City of Kingston acknowledges that we are on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and thanks these nations for their care and stewardship over this shared land. For those of you who are new to Heritage Hour, this is a bi-monthly series which focuses on different aspects of local history and culture. Talks run approximately an hour, and there may be time for questions at the end. Today, we are very lucky to be learning from Rowena McGowan, who is the curator of the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston. Housed in the Anne Bailey Building National Historic Site, the museum is home to Canada's largest collection of artifacts related to the history of healthcare. Visitors can explore exhibits that feature fascinating artifacts and stories that highlight the history of vaccines, nursing, x-rays, patent medicines, and so much more. Situated on the grounds of Canada's oldest public hospital, just steps from Kingston's beautiful waterfront, the museum is open year-round and offers school programming and special events. Today, Rowena will be sharing her knowledge of the early years of Rockwood. Please join me in welcoming her.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. So yes, my name is Rowena McGowan. I'm the curator of the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Rockwood and early mental health care treatment in Canada. So before we get into the meat of the talk, I just want to give a quick content warning. So I am going to be talking about mental illness, I'm going to be talking about stigma against people with mental illnesses, and I'm going to be talking about mistreatment of people with mental illnesses. I will try not to make this, yes? Oh, sorry. Okay, is that what everyone was putting their hands up about? Okay, I'm sorry, I have a little mouse voice, I apologize. Usually they give me a lapel mic because they know I like to wander around, so I'm not used to these handheld ones. All right, so content warning. We are going to be talking about mental illness, stigma against people with mental illnesses, and mistreatment of people with mental illnesses. I'm going to try to make this not too sort of dire, but it's certainly a very heavy topic. So if it's not your cup of tea, if at any point you're uncomfortable, please feel free to step out. All right, so what is Rockwood? Well, it's in the picture right there. So this is a postcard from the Museum of Healthcare's collection. So what Rockwood is Kingston's first psychiatric institution. So it operated for many, many years, and there's a fairly direct line between Rockwood and our current Providence Care. Not a perfectly direct line, but a fairly direct line. Now, when we talk about Rockwood, that is a bit of a complicated word. So Rockwood is the colloquial name for this institution. But there's sort of Rockwood, the institution, and Rockwood, the building that you see up there. And as time goes on, those start to kind of diverge more and more. So it goes through several name changes over its history. There is more land added, there are different buildings, there are satellite buildings. So when you hear someone colloquially speak of Rockwood, they're usually talking about that building, but the institution is also sort of called Rockwood. Luckily, we're sticking to the early days, so we're going to be able to sort of call it Rockwood as a whole. Also, while I have you all here and pinned down, I just want to note that the Museum of Healthcare talks about Rockwood's history, and we do have artifacts from Rockwood, some of which are on the table right there. We don't actually own the building, so we can't give you permission to go in, and we wouldn't if we could. It is not well maintained. I believe there's some asbestos in it. So if you would like to see Rockwood, and it is a beautiful building, we're going to talk a little bit about it being built, please do so from a distance. It is not safe. So, I mentioned that there have been many names over the years, so these are just a few of them covering the time period that I'm going to be talking about. So, 1856, Rockwood Asylum for the Criminally Insane. So, when this institution is founded, the idea is that it's going to house prisoners from Kingston Penitentiary. Unfortunately, we know that even today, people with mental health struggles are overrepresented in the prison system, and this is true then as well. They don't really have any way to handle these people. They are frequently kept in a basement, they're not well treated. At some points in its history, Kingston Penitentiary actually has a rule of silence, so you're not allowed to make any noise, which, as you can imagine, is not great for anyone's mental health, and especially for people who are already struggling when they came in. So they get this idea, we're going to make an institution where we can house people who have been sort of diagnosed as having mental illnesses, and they're going to be sort of better taken care of than they would be at the prison. 1877, Asylum for the Insane, Kingston. This name change kind of reflects two things. First of all, change in authority, so this is a switch to provincial authority for this institution. As well, you can notice that they have taken away criminally insane. So now they are moving very much to just patients from the community rather than specifically patients who are only coming through the criminal justice system. And finally, 1907, Rockwood Hospital for the Insane. So we've gotten rid of that asylum word. Asylum has some very negative connotations, so now we're going to call it a hospital. And kind of the interesting thing about this name and about this date is this change had actually been advocated for a while. So it starts being used before it is official. We actually have a document from, I believe it's 1904, where it's referred to as Rockwood Hospital. So people in the community, journalists, people at Rockwood itself are using this name before it becomes official. They adopt this hospital name. So let's talk about a quick history of kind of the founding of Rockwood. So in 1839, the House of Assembly passes a resolution to create an asylum. They've been talking about this for about 10 years. So the thought is, again, somewhere to house our kind of criminals, people in the criminal justice system with mental illnesses. But actually, unfortunately, Kingston loses out. There are two cities that are considered for this first psychiatric institution in Ontario, and Toronto wins. So they get the first one. And they kind of stopped talking about it, advocating for it strongly in Kingston for a while. And then in 1854, John Palmer Litchfield, hold on to him, he is going to come back. So he rents the Cartwright House. Cartwright was a local merchant, had a lovely property, had a lovely sort of Italian villa-style house. So John Palmer Litchfield rents this in order to, he's going to found a private psychiatric institution. But this kind of spurs this conversation again, and John Palmer Litchfield is one of the people advocating for Kingston to have a psychiatric institution. And he has some quite powerful friends. For example, Sir John A. Macdonald and John Palmer Litchfield are buddies. So in 1856, Upper Canada agrees to found an asylum. And in 1859, construction begins. This is mostly done with convict labor and with locally quarried limestone. Now, there are actually two sort of architectural plans for Rockwood. The first is a Montreal architectural firm. And this design is actually rejected because it is not modern enough. We're starting to get these ideas about sort of asylum reform, making it a nicer place. So this original Montreal design is very prison-like. And they decide, no, we want to make it a nicer place to keep people. So they get William Coverdale. He's designed a couple of buildings in Kingston. He designs a more modern style building. So there are more windows, there's more light, there's more capacity for freedom for patients. And I remember reading a story that he actually designs the bedrooms he's very clever in a little dark kind of way. He actually designs the bedrooms the individual bedrooms to not be too big. Because he's afraid that if they're too big, they'll start housing more than one person in them. Because he is afraid, and we will see this theme throughout the history that I'm talking about, but also throughout sort of history, that Rockwood is going to tend to be under-resourced and overcrowded. And the building is officially opened in 1865. However, the first residents have already been on site for some time. Basically, the minute that this is founded, a bunch of 24 female patients are actually moved on site. Now, there is no building to house them. Rockwood hasn't been built yet, so they're actually housed in the stables. It is refurbished for human habitation, and they actually don't get to move into the official Rockwood building until 1868. And this situation actually inspires a bit of doggerel that I'm going to share with you. I've read multiple different versions of this. They are all pretty much the same, so if you've heard a different version, I'm not sure if just everyone was saying it slightly differently or if it's evolved over time, but they're all basically the same. How I wish that I were able to have a house like Cartwright's stable, for it doth cause me great remorse to be worse housed than Cartwright's horse. So nice little joking poem there. So I've seen two interpretations of this poem. So the first is just kind of this straightforward. Isn't it wild that I have this, sad little house and Cartwright's stable is big enough that they can put 24 people in it. I have also heard the interpretation that this was actually a little bit facetious because it was not actually a particularly nice place for people to inhabit. It was a stable, the refurbishment wasn't that comfortable, so I have heard the interpretation that they were making fun of this situation a little bit with this little rhyme. So why is it important to talk about Rockwood? Well, first of all, it's part of Kingston heritage. It's been around for quite a while. The building, again, you can still go see it from a distance. A lot of what is happening is going to lead very directly into the mental health care that we have today. It's interesting history, but also it is an interesting and important lens through which to view mental health care treatment in this 19th century. So I actually have a question for you. You didn't know there was going to be a test, but there's a test. So my pop quiz is, when was the lobotomy invented? And I actually have a tool that I brought along. It's not, I believe, from Rockwood. So this is a leucotome. It's for lobotomies. That's what this tool is for. And there will be time at the end if you'd like to come see these objects a little closer. But does anyone know when lobotomy was invented? No, I'm seeing heads. Oh, yes.
Sometime around the 1940s or 30s.
Absolutely, you are correct. So it was 1935.
I invented and won a Nobel Prize.
He did win a Nobel Prize. Yep, he did win a Nobel Prize. So the original lobotomy, it's a little bit of a more complicated history. Originally it's called a leucotomy. The lobotomy is like mildly different, but it's basically the same idea. So 1935 is when this is invented. There had been some earlier, a little bit of experimentation with neurosurgery as it relates to mental illness, but it was not widespread. 1935 is really when that pop culture, one flew over the cuckoo's nest, heavy overuse of lobotomies is really going to happen. So when we're talking about this 19th century Rockwood, lobotomies are not happening. They're just not. That's history. It hasn't been invented yet. And I really like to talk about these early days of Rockwood, and the reason I bring up lobotomies is I think there is a tendency to sort of see mental health care before about, say, the 90s, to see it as something that was always, inherently abusive, that was always all about lobotomies and, restraints and sedatives and beatings and poor treatment of people. I have jokingly said that my sort of origin story for being interested in this is watching a German Impressionist film from the 1920s, because I'm extremely cool. And the only friend who was not into medical history made a lobotomy joke and got her head ripped off. But really kind of, illustrates that idea that we have that mental health care treatment has always been lobotomies and this kind of thing. And that's not fair. So Rockwood is an interesting lens to view this. And we know this demonization of mental health treatment can be dangerous. If you are afraid that if you go to psychiatric care that you are going to be sort of attacked and lobotomized, that is going to, maybe frighten people away from treatment. So it has an effect even today. So let's talk about treatment at Rockwood. We're jumping ahead. All right. So who was treated at Rockwood? So in the 19th century, healthcare is tending to happen in the home. That is true of physical illnesses as well as mental illnesses. It is particularly true the higher class you are. So upper class people who have a lot of money in particular, they're better able to house and care for their relatives who are ill. They are able to, have doctors visit them. They are able to have, maybe a private duty nurse come in and take care of them. But even in sort of the lower classes who have less money, generally speaking, if possible, healthcare is going to happen in the home. So generally speaking, the kinds of people who are ending up at Rockwood are going to be the people who don't have support. So people who don't have any family, who are able to take care of them, or whose family does not want to take care of them or does not feel able to take care of them. For instance, there's a couple of stories of, there's been a lot of work specifically done of female patient experience around this time. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. But we have a couple of stories about patients who, were mentally ill, were showing symptoms for many, many years, and they were living in the home and they were being cared for by husbands and relatives, and then their symptoms escalated and they ended up at Rockwood. So again, it's going to tend to be a lot of people for whom there basically are not other options. So Rockwood's first superintendent is John Palmer Litchfield. I told you he was going to come back. So he is around from the founding until 1868. Again, at least part of the reason that he gets this job is because he has some political connections. At the time, the Rockwood superintendency is, it's a bit of a political plum. So it's maybe going to be something that a politician is going to give a doctor who's a buddy. So he is the Rockwood superintendent. He is also for a while the Queen's lecturer in midwifery and state and forensic medicine. He's actually Australian, so he has immigrated to Canada. In Australia, he was a hospital inspector. He also ran his own private psychiatric institution before immigrating to Canada. And he was a journalist. So notice that I did not say he is a trained doctor, because as far as we've been able to reconstruct, he did not actually have a medical degree. Queen's refers to him as a charming con man. So eventually he does lose his role as the lecturer in midwifery and state forensic medicine because he does not have a degree, and apparently they discovered that he had never attended a birth, but he does get to keep his job at Rockwood. And in the classic story of faking it until you make it, John Palmer Litchfield does die a doctor. He is eventually awarded a medical degree from Queen's, and he gets his job back lecturing in, I believe, forensic medicine. So really kind of a fake it until you make it type. So possibly because he did not actually have any medical training, he was very reliant on things like overuse of sedatives and restraints at Rockwood. In particular, his joke apparently was that the best treatment was Scotch ale or Dublin Stout, I believe, so alcohol. We're just going to give the patients a bunch of alcohol so they sleep quietly. So it's not a great time to be treated at Rockwood. It's also not a particularly nice facility. The bedding is not very nice, the clothing is not comfortable, the food doesn't tend to be very good. It is a beautiful limestone building, but it is a bit forbidding, and the interior is not quite as nice as the exterior. However, apparently one of the things that he did advocate for was taking non-criminal patients. And at least one of the reasons that he did this was because he was afraid that if people, if the only way that you could access healthcare for your mentally ill relatives was to have them arrested, people would do it. So he doesn't think that's fair, so he does advocate for taking in non-criminal patients. So after John Palmer Litchfield, we have John Robinson Dixon. There's a lot of Johns in this story. So he is the superintendent from 1868, and then he retires in 1878. He is an actual doctor. He is also a teetotaler. So a teetotaler is someone who does not believe in alcohol. So he comes in and he's quite upset at how much alcohol is being used at Rockwood, as well as how much tobacco is being used, so he immediately shuts that down. He also attempts to bring in some sort of rudimentary occupational therapy. He is trying to kind of make it a little bit of a better place. For instance, we know that he asked for some money to buy things like books and a magic lantern, so a picture show for the patients. Unfortunately, he was denied that funding. I'm going to hit that point again. Rockwood is under-resourced for basically its entire life. Now he retires, and he is replaced by my personal favorite of these early days, William Metcalf. So William Metcalf is the superintendent from 1878 to 1885. When he takes on the role, he is not very happy at the state that Rockwood is in. Again, bad bedding, bad food, bad clothing, and the attendants are not very good. So the attendants are tending to be poorly paid, poorly trained, some of them are too old to do their jobs properly. They are not treating the patients well, and we see a theme throughout these early days. Even if the superintendents are trying to sort of roll back on the sedation and on the use of restraints, the attendants are pushing back because it's more work for them. So Metcalf gets rid of a lot of them. He replaces them with sort of better attendants, younger attendants, better trained attendants. I can't remember if it's him or Clark, I apologize. But they do get raises eventually, because of course we should pay people for their work. And he's a moral therapy reformer. So he's also bringing in better bedding. He's bringing in better food, more comfortable clothing, more freedom for patients. So he has some cottages built on the site. So some patients can kind of live on site and have a little more home-like atmosphere. Because again, it's a beautiful building, but it's a big forbidding limestone building. He's also a pretty decent plumber. And I don't point this out just because I personally find that impressive because plumbing is really hard, but he's doing maintenance on the building. So he's the superintendent. He's supposed to be providing psychiatric care. He is supposed to be doing paperwork. He is supposed to be, publishing about his work here. And instead, he is ending up having to do a lot of maintenance on the building. The pipes are not particularly great at this point. And that is a really big problem because even if you are struggling with mental illness, of course, you still live in a body, and your body can get sick. And we know that disease was a problem at Rockwood. In Metcalf's time, typhoid is a particularly big problem. Tuberculosis is going to be a problem for a lot of Rockwood's history. There's a number of diseases kind of being sort of circulating. So part of his job in doing sort of this plumbing, this maintenance, handling the heating, et cetera, is that he's trying to make this a more hygienic, comfortable place so people are not actively getting ill. So you'll notice that even though he's this very sort of, excited person who's really, really invested in improving Rockwood, he's not there for that long. He's done in 1885, and unfortunately there's a tragic reason for that. So in 1885, he is attacked by a patient and he does succumb to his injuries 3 days later. So unfortunately we do lose Metcalf. So he is replaced by Charles Court Clark. There's been a lot of work done on Charles Court Clark. So Charles Court Clark, he is not just Metcalf's replacement. First of all, he was the assistant superintendent from about 81, I believe, onwards. And he is a very good friend of Metcalf. He is a brother-in-law of Metcalf, and they studied together. So they both studied in Toronto together under Joseph Workman, who is a very important figure in Canadian psychiatry, and in particular another reformer, like these two gentlemen are. Again, Charles Court Clark, also a moral therapy reformer, and the reason that he's at Rockwood is because Metcalf had contacted him and said, hey, I'm in charge, come be my assistant, we're gonna fix this place up together. And one of the things that I really, really love about Charles Court Clark is he is there during the attack. He is attacked as well, but he does manage to sort of fight off the attacker, he does survive this attack, and he is completely undeterred by this tragic event. Again, Metcalf and he are, some sources refer to them as best friends. His best friend is essentially killed in front of him. And this is the morally correct thing to do, but of course it's emotionally hard to not become embittered by that. And he wasn't. He immediately starts in on all of these moral therapy reforms. He picks up exactly where Metcalf leaves off. And he actually takes the superintendent's job specifically because he wants to take care of the patients, because he hates politics. He is really worried about being a superintendent of Rockwood because he does not want to be involved in sort of that political jockeying. Again, his job is kind of a political plum at the time, but he really wants to protect the patients, and he's afraid that if just some, random doctor who wants a fancy position takes the position, they're not going to treat the patients well. So he takes this job on, and he continues on with these moral therapy reforms, and later on he becomes a very, very celebrated psychiatrist in Canadian history. This is really kind of not the very beginning of his career, but certainly when his career really starts to kick off. So you've heard me talk a lot about moral therapy, so let's talk about what moral therapy actually is now that we're with these gentlemen who are doing it. So before moral therapy, we have this sort of asylum model, and asylum has a negative connotation today, obviously, for very valid reasons. The idea behind an asylum was not meant to be a bad one. If you think of the actual word asylum, it's a nice word. It means a refuge, it means a sanctuary. So there had always been this idea that an asylum could be a safe place where people who were not fitting well in society and were not being well taken care of could kind of go and be taken care of. The way it was implemented is often, as we know, these very sort of unsafe and abusive circumstances, but the idea had not necessarily been right from the start, that it to have this dark history. However, inherently the model tended to be custodial. So the idea is that, you know, once you are diagnosed, you go into the institution and then you're going to be there forever and they're just going to take care of you. Hopefully they're going to take care of you well. Unfortunately, sometimes they are not, but you don't have to leave. So one of the big tenets of moral therapy, curative care. So instead of keeping people forever, we're going to cure them and we're going to let them go. They get to leave. You know, one of the main tenets of moral therapy is mental illness is an illness, and because it is an illness, it is curable. And so actually actively treating the patient is very, very important in moral therapy. So how are we going to treat the patient? Well, we don't really know how the brain works at this point. We don't really have a strong sense of what causes mental illnesses, what the sort of factors that may go into it are. But one of our other big ideas, which is very important, is our inherent dignity of the patient. So we want to be nice to the patient. We want to recognize that they're a person. This can be very, very patronizing. So generally speaking, the model of moral therapy is going to be that the institution is a family. The psychiatrist is the father and the patients are the children. So this is not a relationship of equals, but it is sort of, there's an inherent expectation that this father figure psychiatrist is going to treat the patients well. That he is going to protect them, that he is going to look after them, and that he is going to be a figure that they can trust. And that they should trust him, that this relationship should be a loving and caring one. So again, we're not treating them as equals yet, but we are recognizing that these patients are people and that they should be treated well. So what else are we going to do? Because again, we don't have a lot of treatment options available. Good food and fresh air. So before this point, and we see this at Rockwood, in particular food tending to not be very pleasant, and you aren't tending to get to sit up nicely at table. So one of Metcalf's big innovations is patients actually get to have silverware. Before this point, they are getting spoons or they are eating with their fingers. And the food gets better under Metcalf. So you're going to give people good food. There's this idea that, you know, poor nutrition is one of the problems that causes mental illness, as well as fresh air. People get to go outside, they get to walk around, they get to have a little more freedom. And finally, we have meaningful work. So meaningful work is the idea of you give a patient a job, and they contribute to the institution, and this is going to be helpful to them. You know, this idea of work is going to be helpful for, you know, their self-esteem. They get to contribute. It's going to give them something to do. And I'm sure you can immediately see that there's an inherent sort of risk in this idea of meaningful work. So, and you are correct. If you've ever heard of Foucault, he's a historian philosopher, and he passionately hates moral therapy because it's a terrible idea. And his sort of main protest is that moral therapy is not actually about making people better. What it is about making them behave in a proper middle-class fashion. So you're a good middle-class citizen, so you are going to sit up at a table with your nice middle-class manners at your middle-class dining time, and you are going to eat good middle-class food. You're a good middle-class person, you're going to have a job. You know, you're going to contribute to society because that's what good middle-class people do. As well, there was genuinely some belief that this meaningful work was mentally helpful, but certainly there was an economic benefit to it. So, Rockwood is not the only psychiatric institution that is going to be under-resourced, and if you have your patients actually helping you run the institution, obviously that is going to save you staff time and staffing costs. So there is a genuine economic benefit to this. Now, the model as it is sort of, you know, theoretical is that people are not forced to work, they can just, you know, they can if they want to. How much that is actually implemented, a little more debatable, and it's going to be a little more along class lines. So if you're rich, your relatives are probably contributing financially to the institution. You are much less likely to be pressured into working than if you are lower class and expected to sort of contribute and earn your way. The other thing is that it tends to be very, very gendered, and we see this at Rockwood. So at Rockwood. So I have this, unfortunately I couldn't bring it because it's huge, it's about this big and incredibly heavy. But we have this brilliant lawnmower from Rockwood. So this is a hand lawnmower, and one of the things that patients would have been doing, and specifically male patients, would have been groundskeeping. They also typically would have been working on the farm, because Rockwood had a farm for many, many years. Female patients are working inside the institution, so they are doing things like they're doing women's work, so they're doing laundry, but typically the women are not getting to work outside, so the men are getting more fresh air. As well, the men's work tends to be a little more cyclical and to have more gaps in it. So for instance, you're not going to be doing the same level of work on the farm every day. You're maybe not going to have to cut grass every day. Maybe you will because that lawnmower is really, really heavy, but typically it's going to be a lot more cyclical. Whereas if you're a woman and you're doing this sort of domestic work, that really never stops. You are constantly going to be having to do more laundry, having to do more cooking, having to do more cleaning, so you're also tending to have less free time. So it is not an equal division of labor. And as I said, there's definitely this economic benefit, and we do see that at Rockwood. However, moral therapy is this kind of step forward in terms of treatment of patients. Yeah?
What time period are you talking here?
We're in Clark and Metcalf, so 78 to 1905.
Sorry?
78 to 1905.
Oh, from 1995.
Sorry, 1878 to 1905.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Oh, yeah, I apologize. I think my microphone is bobbing a little bit.
Perspective.
Yeah, so we're talking about basically turn of the century here. Late 19th century to early 20th century when this is being implemented at Rockwood. Moral therapy is being implemented in other places, specifically Europe, much, much earlier. So thank you for that clarifying question. So, how does Clark implement a lot of these moral therapy ideas? So we've already seen with Metcalf, he thinks that there should be sort of better people taking care of the patients, providing more compassionate care for the patients. Clark goes a step forward and he actually founds a psychiatric nursing school. So his idea behind this, and again, we've got kind of some gendered ideas going on here, because the original nursing school is only for women. He has this idea that, women are more compassionate, women are more nurturing, so women are going to be better for sort of providing this, care for the patients. So he founds this nursing school in the late 1880s. This is around the same time that nursing schools are being founded in other places in Canada. And it's an apprenticeship style program. So you are going to be studying at the same time you are going to be working. The psychiatric nursing school is very, very rigorous. So they are learning everything that you would learn at a general hospital nursing school as well as psychiatric nursing. And this is really, really important because it is actually kind of proof of concept of this idea of a psychiatric nursing school. Once it works, and it's not well respected when it first opens, the graduates, if they don't want to work at Rockwood, if they want to work at a general hospital, they actually have to do a year of training before they're accepted. But it becomes this proof of concept, and we get more and more psychiatric nursing schools opening in Canada. And psychiatric nurse is a separate job still in some parts of Canada, I believe to the west. In Ontario, I believe it's a specialty. I've never quite understood how that works in Ontario, but I know it's not a separate program, a completely separate program the way it would have been during Clark's time. And I actually have another set of objects for you here, and again, you can come up afterwards to see them. So what we have are, these are reproductions, so I'm going to touch them with my hands, but this is the uniform that they would be wearing in the 1880s. And you can see, here's the shirt, the skirt. We're not done yet. We're going to have an apron over top of that. You can see why they didn't put it all together for me, because it's very heavy. And then you're going to need to tie your hair back. So you're actually going to have this cap that you're going to tie around your hair to kind of keep it out of your face and make it look fancy. So, and if you imagine, psychiatric nursing is not an easy job, and nursing in general is going to be, at this time period, a lot of, well, as it is today, but it's different, hard physical labor, and you're doing a lot more sort of custodial work, cleaning, that kind of thing. If you're a psychiatric nurse specifically, you're dealing with patients who we know, we have records, were occasionally being violent with you. So if you imagine trying to do all of that in that incredibly heavy uniform, they were quite dressed up. He also introduces more freedom for patients. This had started with Metcalf in 1878 and continues on in this 1885 Clark era. And he also introduces more recreation for patients, So things like, and again, this is going to start with Metcalf, and it's going to continue under Clark. So things like field trips, going out on boats, going to fairs, sports. His children, Clark's children, have a little newspaper on site that they distribute to patients. As well, Clark founds an orchestra that consists of patients and attendants, and it's actually sort of tours the local area. And there's two really important reasons that Clark does this. First of all, just patient care. It's just nice for patients, you know, they get to go out, they get to do things, it's nice for their mental health. As well, he thinks it's really, really important for them to get out in the community. Because, don't forget, we're operating under this moral therapy model, we're operating under curative care. So we want people to get better, we want them to be able to leave and integrate back into the community. But there is some stigma against people who have, you know, had to get mental health care, who have been in psychiatric institutions. That's true even today, and it's true back then. So Clark is afraid that, you know, if they are known to have been in a psychiatric institution, which they likely would have, because Rockwood did not have a ton of privacy at the time, there's going to be stigma, and it's going to be hard for them to integrate. So he thinks that if he does things like this orchestra where they get to go and just kind of be normal and show off their talents, that this will let people be exposed to these patients and see that, you know, they're not scary. They're just normal human beings who were sick for a while and now that they're better. So he thinks that's really, really important. And I actually have some recreation artifacts here. So we have a woodworking tool. This is apparently from Clark's time. So they actually did working there. They actually had a broom factory for a while, but it was very, very successful, and it was too successful. It was too competitive, so they had to shut it down. This one is way after Clark, but people tend to get a kick out of it, so I brought it along. So this is actually a softball trophy. So yeah, we also have a bowling trophy that's a little more delicate, so it didn't get to come. Yes?
Were the approaches of Clark and Metcalf kind of in line with the prevailing wisdom of the time, or were they particularly progressive?
Yes and no at the same time. They were not wildly progressive. They were not doing something that had never been heard of before. And certainly they were getting support for this, but they were progressive in the sense that, you know, they were a little bit more on leading edge in Canada. Moral therapy had been around in Europe for a while. So, and I also, this artifact is currently on display, so I wasn't able to bring it, but it is one of my favorites and I really want to show it off. So this is after Clark. This is 1949, but I do love it very, very much. So what this is this was a patient who thought he was the Emperor of Japan, and he would bestow degrees on his favorite attendants, and he would also write them checks. This one I believe is for $3 million. So, and what I really, really, really love about this artifact is it sort of is this sign of this change in relationships between these attendants and these patients. When we're talking about, you know, the Litchfield era, the Dixon era, this Metcalf, you know, early Metcalf, you know, it's very antagonistic, it's aggressive, the attendants are not tending to treat the patients very well, they're not even necessarily treating them like people. However, you know, starting with Metcalf and Clark, we do start to see these sort of much warmer relationships, you know, these friendships, you know, these senses sometimes that they're in this together. Because Rockwood, again, getting this theme again, Rockwood's under-resourced for much of its life. You know, a lot of times patients and attendants are working together to keep it running. We have stories of, you know, the patient will be holding the ladder and the nurse will be climbing the ladder to clean the ceiling. One of my favorite stories is from the Second World War, I believe. The nurses were ordered to knit for the troops overseas. They did not have time to knit. They were overworked even before the war started. They were certainly overworked when they had lost a lot of staff to the war effort. So patients apparently would secretly knit for them. And we even have later stories of patients actually choosing to help attendants out with their duties so they could go back to playing cards. And a lot of that is going to kind of start with Metcalf and Clark of that sort of more compassionate care. So again, this is 1949, so way after Clark leaves in 1905, but I do think it's a really delightful artifact to demonstrate that there could be this sort of warmth and kindness between staff and between patients. So, we've talked a lot about Clark and what a snuggly teddy bear he is, and I do want to acknowledge that there is more to his history than his time at Rockwood. So Clark leaves Rockwood in 1905. A big reason he does that, he's just really sick of the politics of Rockwood. But also he gets a new job in Toronto, a little more prestigious, so off he goes. And he's also increasingly getting interested in the mental hygiene movement. So the mental hygiene movement is basically this idea that instead of having institutions where we put people, you know, when they need it, when they get very, very sick, we're going to actually preserve their mental health in the community so they never get to the point that they get institutionalized. We're going to, you know, keep them healthy and able to be, you know, integrated in the community. Which is a nice idea. We talk about similar ideas today. Unfortunately, one of the ways that Clark thinks that we should preserve Canadian mental health is he's an early proponent of the eugenics movement. And in particular, he's very anti-immigration. And Clark's idea is that, and he advocates about this, let's say, is that other countries, specifically the UK, are sending their, please see my air quotes here, mental defectives to Canada. So, you know, they're getting rid of the citizens that they don't like and that are sort of lower class, and they're making Canada deal with them. So he's very, very anti-immigration for a while. He advocates against immigration. He makes it very, very difficult for some immigrants, particularly British home children. And because he is a very, very, very major figure in Canadian psychiatry, a lot of his talking points are kind of being used by anti-immigration politicians. So I do want to acknowledge that he had that side to him, because when we talk about really his work at Rockwood, it tends to be very, very positive. And I do want to acknowledge that psychiatry as a whole had a really kind of dark history with eugenics for a while, and Clark was involved in that. So I talked a lot about moral therapy, and you may never have heard of moral therapy. You probably don't know anyone who went to the doctor and got prescribed a course of moral therapy. So it really falls out of favor as we go into the 20th century. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, lack of resources. So moral therapy does take resources. Okay, you need your land, your site. You need space for people to walk around, for them to work. You need staff to take care of them, to give them work, to supervise them. So people were implementing it and not doing it very well and saying, well, it doesn't work. New treatment methods. So psychoanalysis becomes very, very big right after moral therapy. Kind of becomes the new popular thing after moral therapy. So Freud, this idea of you're going to talk to people, you're going to sort of dig down in their psyche, and you're going to cure them that way. Later on, we get all sorts of other things. The lobotomy, as we've already talked about, very, very big for a while, and it's based on bad science right from the get-go, bad ethics. Originally, it is sort of intended to be used for very, very extreme cases. So people who, there's no other treatment method, people who are having very, very extreme symptoms and, basically no quality of life. We do know that it is wildly and unethically overused, and please don't walk away with, oh, the curator of the Museum of Healthcare says lobotomies are great. Actually, they're very bad. They're a very dark spot on psychiatric history. But in the very early days, there definitely was a sense that oh, this is going to be a great method to help people that we really can't help otherwise. There's excitement about them. We get things like ECT. So I have some electrodes here. So that, we still use it today. It is much, much safer now, and it's really, really helpful in some cases. We get things that have also fallen out of favor. So insulin shock. Continuous bath therapy for a while is we're going to give people more baths to calm them down. And as well, finally, and this is going to be a really, really big one, medicine. So medication has always been used in some form. We talked about the use of sedatives in the early days of Rockwood, but as the 20th century is rolling on, we're getting a better and better sense of how the brain's chemistry works. And we're getting more and more of an idea that we can actually interact with the brain's chemistry, and we can alter it, and we can help people that way. So medication becomes very, very important in psychiatric treatment and very, very popular. Of course, now we use a combination of a lot of things, but it's definitely one of those things that when it first sort of starts to become popular, this becomes the, oh, this is going to cure everything. Nothing ever cures everything, but we're excited about it for a while. And that plays into my final point about moral therapy, which is that not really all that effective. And what I mean by this is, it is better than sort of this previous model of just sort of locking people up and mistreating them. Obviously, your mental health is going to be better if people are nice to you, if you get to eat well, if you are treated well, if you get to go outside. But moral therapy doesn't tend to be directly intervening. So I've heard it described as it does not cure you, but it gives you space to cure yourself. And I think that's probably a pretty good description. So if you're in a situation that is harming your mental health, you know, if you're in an abusive situation, or maybe you're under a short-term stressor, and you get to go to a psychiatric institution and relax and rest, you're probably going to get better. You know, it's going to help cure you. However, if you have something that is going to need more direct intervention, for example, we do know that there were epileptic patients at Rockwood, and epilepsy is not something that you are going to be able to cure by, you know, letting people go outside and take a boat ride. We know that now. You know, it needs sometimes surgical intervention or medication. So that's not something that maybe you will do a little better at Rockwood, but it's not going to be like curative care. So it falls out of favor because it's just simply not that effective. But of course, it is a really, really important step forward in psychiatric care, and it is foundational for what we do today. So I've talked a lot about curative care. Did patients ever actually get better and get discharged from Rockwood? And the answer is yes, they absolutely did. So there's a study by Danielle Terbenche, I believe that's how you pronounce her name. She's actually done a lot of work on Rockwood, and specifically the female patient experience at Rockwood. So she did a study on female patients 1878 to 1884, so those are the Metcalf years. Some of this study actually goes into 1906, which is Clark. And about 40% of these female patients were discharged because they were recovered or improved, and so many after only a short stay. And part of this sort of statistic is, again, that familial support. If you have a support network, it is much easier for you to be discharged from an institution like this. Because again, some of these people were in this institution because their symptoms had escalated, and their family couldn't look after them anymore, even though they maybe wanted to. So if they can kind of, you know, have that space for their symptoms to de-escalate, they get to go home, they get to go, you know, live with their families. If it's something short-term, say there was a patient who had moved far away from her family for work, she had a bit of a nervous breakdown as far as we can tell, so she got better, she got to go back to her family, and she, as far as we know, was fine. As well, it's important to note that a long-term stay was not necessarily a bad thing, because Rockwood, it's been argued, could have been a refuge for some people if you were in a situation that was quite dire otherwise. So we do know that, you know, there were people there who were homeless, who didn't have anyone else to look after them, people who had come to Rockwood from abusive situations, and this was the safest place that they could be. So a long-term stay could be the best place that was possible for you at the time period. Now, does all this mean that everyone who was, you know, taken care of at Rockwood had an absolutely wonderful time and was super well treated and got better, and anyone who says they didn't is, and I use this word very deliberately, crazy? No. Okay? What I am saying through this talk is that Rockwood is complex, and it's an imperfect institution in an imperfect world. It is not that sort of pop culture, you know, it was always evil, all the time, scary asylum institution. It was complex. And a lot of times, the struggle was that it was people who were doing the best that they could with the resources and with the knowledge that they had. All right, you've been very patient, so thank you so much. And I just want to note, again, I am from the Museum of Healthcare, so I've got all our contact information up there. If you absolutely loved having me talk at you, I do talk to people on our blog as well, so we do have blogs that are written, and we also have an audio if you prefer sort of that oral. If you would like to see some of our objects, a lot of them are available on our online catalog at hcandvermont.com. If you would like to talk to us, there's our phone number, there's our general info, and if you would like to visit, and if specifically you are interested in Rockwood, we currently have an exhibit on about it, and we are open 10 to 4, Monday to Friday, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to say a very, very sincere thank you to Rowena for such an insightful and engaging talk about a really, really important aspect of Kingston's heritage. We're going to have time for questions in just a few minutes, but before we do that, I just want to thank everybody who's here today and who's been attending Heritage Hour over the past few months, and maybe even over the past few years. We really, really appreciate all of your engagement in local heritage and all of your passion for it. And it's been wonderful meeting all of you. So, as I said, Rowena's kindly agreed to stay and answer questions. We also have artifacts up here, but perhaps I can take the microphone around so that everybody can hear people's questions. And then if there's time at the end as well, before Rowena leaves, you can also come up to see the artifacts. But don't feel like you have to stay. I know that this is over the lunch break. If you would like to, though, then you're more than welcome.